In today's ThinkScript tutorial, we'll be building our very own TTM Squeeze Histogram Backtester. Now this is different from previous backtesters we've built because we're really focused in on the histogram this time as opposed to the actual squeeze indicator. The goal here is to determine, is the histogram useful in trying to capture momentum swings in the market? Now this particular tutorial may be a bit longer, so feel free to use the timestamps to jump around, and I'll also leave a download link in the description box below. Now before we dive in a little bit further, let's take a look at an example of what these momentum swings even look like. Here's an example of the TTM Squeeze indicator. It's a free indicator built inside of your ThinkOrSwim platform. There's really two different outputs or plots of this indicator. The first are the dots, and they can either be green or red in the built-in version. That really tells us, are we in a squeeze or are we not in a squeeze? Red dots meaning in a squeeze, green not in a squeeze. But that's not what we care about in this tutorial. What we are paying attention to are these histogram bars here. The histogram bars are what we're going to be using to try and find these momentum shifts in the market. There's 4 different colors of the histogram bars. They can either be red, yellow, cyan, or blue. So those are the 4 colors that we're really going to interact with and try and find some patterns, clues, and use that to predict momentum shifts. So let me show you an example of what I mean. Here's one particular shift in the market using the histogram bars. We can see we had consecutive red histogram bars suggesting downwards momentum, and that first yellow histogram bar is our sign that, hey, that momentum might be shifting more towards at least a temporary bullish shift. So that's an idea of what we're looking at. Now, of course, we can add more rules into this to try and find ways to ride the momentum, try and define what we really determine as a momentum shift, and for that we have some simple rules. One of those might be something as easy as looking for 7 consecutive bars of one color. So for example, 7 red bars, which suggest we now have declining momentum, and that first yellow bar is our sign of increasing momentum, so that's a bullish twist. The second example is the exact opposite, where if we have, say, 7 cyan histogram bars, so for example 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that means we have some sort of a bullish move here, and that first blue histogram bar suggests that, hey, momentum is now shifting from the upside to at least a temporary pause, if not a shorter term pullback. So that's the goal of what we're looking to backtest here. It's these reversal points and trying to determine, are they really effective in predicting these momentum shifts? Now to do that, we're really going to need to define some rules, and those rules we can then turn into code. So here's an example of what we will be building, a final product, but we can use that to determine one of these shifts. So inside of this chart right here, this is the S&P 500, we can see that the backtester is taking an entry right here and taking an exit right here. Let's take a look at the histogram down here below to see where the entries and the exits correlate to. Now for our entry, we can see we had declining momentum here. We had more than 7 consecutive red bars. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way down until momentum keeps increasing to the downside. And finally, we then have our first yellow histogram bar suggesting that, hey, that momentum may be shifting a little bit. Once we have that yellow histogram bar, that's where the backtester actually takes our entry. We're looking to try and ride that wave for as long as possible until we see that first sign that, hey, that momentum may be starting to stall out and now starting to decrease, which we can see here with this blue histogram bar, and that's exactly where the backtester exits the trade. So that's one example. This was of course a bullish trade, but hopefully paints the idea of what we're looking for with these shifts. Now to turn that into rules, we can use the following. We really have our entry conditions. We've defined the entry as 7 consecutive histogram bars of the same color, really paying particular attention to either 7 cyan bars, in which if we have a blue bar, that suggests a bearish momentum shift, so that's our bearish scenario. And we have the bullish scenario, in which we have 7 consecutive red bars, and that first yellow bar is where we're looking for a bullish shift inside of momentum. So we have 2 different types there of entry conditions, bullish and bearish, each one determined by the preceding trend or the preceding consecutive histogram bars. The actual price we'll use is the closing price of the candle in which this condition is true. Now for our exit, we're looking to try and ride this momentum for as long as possible. So for our bullish side, or a bullish trade, we would be looking to try and ride this all the way up until we have our first declining histogram bar, suggesting that this momentum has now exhausted. So taking a look here, we can see that once we have this yellow, the histogram bars keep increasing, increasing, increasing. We go positive, and then we finally have that first declining momentum bar when it goes blue. On the opposite hand, for our bearish scenario, that's the exact opposite. So that's our first sign of an increasing histogram bar, which would suggest that, hey, now momentum is starting to pick back up. Same idea as our entry, we're using the closing price for our exit price that will be used in the backtester. Now, for those of you that would like to skip the tutorial, or maybe you'd like to jump around or have a version in your platform while we build it together, you can download the version of the backtester we'll build for free, and I've left a link to that in the description box below. Using it, you can backtest the momentum shifts and reversals that we just talked about. You can also tweak the entry RSI thresholds. This will make more sense as we start building our code. It's really used to try and filter out some of the false signals or the noise that we might see. And this backtester will work on whatever chart you're looking at, whatever time frame. Now for Volatility Box members, I've taken this one step further, and I've turned this entire backtester into something that's a little bit more useful and makes your research much more streamlined. So this is useful for those of you trying to, say, gauge strategy statistics in one easy glance. You can see how many winners we had, how many losers we had, what the average win percentage was, what the average loss percentage was, and what the average trade duration is. And of course, this too works on any time frame chart, which really allows you to, in one quick glance, get an idea of how effective the histogram is in timing these reversals. Now let me show you an example of both backtesters on our ThinkOrSwim charts, so you have a visual idea of what each one is, and then we'll start building our code for the version of the backtester we'll build in this tutorial. Now let me start by showing you an example of what we're going to be building in this particular tutorial. Here's an example of the backtester. If I zoom in, you can see the backtester enters whenever we have these momentum shifts, and it tries to ride the momentum for as long as possible. So here, for example, we can see the momentum is starting to shift to the downside, and it rides this momentum all the way up until we see this first yellow bar. If I zoom in, another example here, same idea. This is a bearish momentum shift. We have that first blue bar, we ride this momentum all the way down until we have that first yellow histogram bar. Now, if you wanted to gauge what the trade statistics are for this, you would right-click, then click Show Report, and this is the P&L that you can then start to dissect, start to plug either into Excel or manually analyze to get more statistics. This becomes a little bit harder to do when, say, instead of 5 days, maybe you want to backtest 30 days worth of data. Now, if I right-click and click Show Report, you have many more trades that you need to comb through to try and find simple things like the win versus loss ratio. What is your average trade gain? What is your average trade loss? That's where the labels and those strategy bubbles start to come into play. So now let me show you an example of what the Volatility Box version looks like. There, I'll add in that sample file, and I can remove our current backtester. And using that sample file here, let's turn on our short and long entries, apply, and you can very easily gauge in one quick glance what the trade statistics look like. For example, on the S&P on a 5-minute time frame chart, this is going back a total of 30 days. You can see we had 12 winners, but 32 losers on the long side. On the short side, 17 winners, 23 losers, so a little bit better ratio there. You can also find things like the average win versus loss ratio, along with what is the average duration that the histogram bars tend to rise or decline before we see a shift in the reverse direction. This is also easy to try and, say, shift down your focus. We were looking at 30 days. Let's say you want to see what the recent bias here is inside of the histogram momentum bars. There, if we say contract this down to 5 days, over the past 5 days, you can see that the bearish ratio improves, and you see that in one quick, easy glance. Our long side trade setup there, still overall a 50% win to loss, so nothing too crazy. However, on the short side, all of a sudden 9 winners, 1 loser, and the average winner there is greater, much greater than the average loser. Very easy to see that. You can also see the average trade duration, about 17 bars on that 5-minute time frame chart, before momentum again shifts back in the preceding direction. So that's the difference between the two versions. Again, download links for both are in the description box below. Volatility Box members, this version is included for free with your membership, and there's also a tutorial which shows you how we build it, and it's all part of the Squeeze course, which is included with your membership. Now with that out of the way, let's start building the version that we're going to build in this tutorial, which allows us to, at the very least, measure the P&L differences of these momentum shifts and answer the simple question, is the histogram even useful? Alright, so let me remove both of these studies or just that one, click apply, and now let's start by creating our very own study. Once you're inside of your platform, click the studies icon, then switch over to the strategies tab, that's very important, and then click create. Now we can give our backtester a name, I'll call it let's call it Squeeze Histogram Backtester, and now we can start writing some code. I'll leave this add order condition for the time being so that we don't have any errors right off the bat. Now inside of the code, there's a few things that we need to define, but I think the most fundamental one, which should be obvious, is the actual histogram. We need to bring that over from the TTM Squeeze study and bring that into our custom backtester. An easy way to do that is to simply reference the Squeeze histogram inside of this study by the following. We'll say def histogram, and there I can say TTM Squeeze, referencing the built-in study, and there I'm looking to access the plot, which is the histogram plot. Once we do that, we very easily, in one quick line, have the histogram that we can then reference inside of this indicator. Once we have the histogram, we can then divide this into the 4 different colors that we have, which will make it much easier as we go down the line to interact with our code. So we said we had 4 colors, cyan, blue, red, and yellow. So let's go ahead and define each one. I'll write a comment so we know what we're doing. So I'll say cyan, blue, yellow, and red histogram bar definitions. And there, let's start with the cyan one. So for cyan, we'll say def cyan, and we'll define this variable. For a cyan histogram bar, the histogram needs to be above 0, and it needs to be increasing compared to the previous histogram bar. So to do that, we can say histogram is greater than the previous histogram bar, and our histogram is greater than 0. Once we have that, we can copy paste that line one more time. Instead of cyan, we'll call this blue, and the only difference for the blue is our histogram bar is decreasing compared to the previous bar, but it's still above 0. Now we have our red histogram bar. Our red histogram bar is the same idea, we're declining compared to the previous histogram bar, and our histogram is less than 0. And for our yellow histogram bar, that's similar to the cyan line, or cyan histogram, excuse me, where our histogram is increasing in comparison to the previous bar, but it's still below 0. So now we have our 4 colors defined. Let's go ahead and test this out to see if this is working the way we would expect. We can see here on our charts, let me click OK and zoom in for you. Inside of this, our current histogram bar is red. So let's see if that is what our code is also telling us. I'll use the add label function here to test this out. Let's say add label, always plot this to be true, and inside I'll output the value red, and let's just make this color.yellow. Now, if this is working the way we expect, this label should plot somewhere here in the top left, and it should have a value of 1 inside of it, which would mean that, hey, this value right here is true, meaning we have a red histogram bar. Let's see if that works. Click apply. And here we can see we have a 1 in the top left, letting us know that, hey, this is working the way we expect. We do have a red histogram bar on this current chart. Now let's make sure it isn't always plotting 1. So let's use, say, cyan here and plug that in where we wrote red. This value should now change to a 0 once we click apply, which would mean that, hey, we don't have a cyan bar on this current bar. It's red, so this value should be false. Let's click apply, and there we can see this goes to 0. So we know so far we're referencing the histogram bars correctly, and we've also defined them using their colors correctly, which now makes it much easier for us to do things like calculate consecutive X type of bars in a row. So let's move on to doing that next. I'll click enter. Now let's go ahead and define the consecutive momentum bars. So I'll say consecutive momentum histogram bars. And there are really 2 colors that we were trying to pay attention to here. They were the cyan bars, the cyan histogram bars, and the red histogram bars. So let's go ahead and define each one. I'll start with the cyan ones. Let's say def min cyan bars. And here we can use the sum function to check, say, over X number of bars, do we have the cyan candles and do we have them plotting true over that same number of bars? So we had 7 here as the number we defined. So over the past 7 bars, take the sum of the cyan candle value, and is that greater than or equal to the same 7? If that's true, then we will have a 1 or a true condition, and if that's false, we'll have a 0 or a false condition. So let's go ahead and define the red one first, and then we can test both of these out. So for our red, def min red bars is equal to sum of the count of red bars over the past 7 bars should be greater than or equal to 7 for this condition to be true. Now let's go ahead and test this. So instead of add label, I'll now use our add chart bubble function to test this out. And let's say every time we have this condition true, plot this chart bubble, and let's plot this at the closing price. We'll plot the actual value inside, which should be 1 anytime we see this bubble plotting. And let's give this bubble a color of yellow. Now what we should see, if this is working correctly, is a chart bubble with the number 1 inside of it every time we have at least 7 cyan histogram bars in a row, so 7 consecutive bars. Let's test this out. I'll click apply, OK, apply, and let's take a look. So here we can see our first bubble plotting right here. That's this bar. Let's count back and see if we have 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And that's the first time we see that number 1 plotting. If I zoom out, you can see other examples of this as well, and this bubble will keep plotting all the way up until we have that first blue bar, which makes it very useful when we're trying to do things like build this backtester. Now let's test the reverse side as well to make sure both conditions are working. So now the min red bars, I'll plug that in. We should see the exact opposite here. So the 1 whenever we have 7 plus red bars in a row, apply, OK. So the first time we see it, well, we see it right now. Let's count to make sure we actually have 7 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's why we see a 1 plotting on our charts. Same thing right here, 1, and that, if you count back, would give you 7 bars as well. So we know this is working the way we expect. So as of right now, we've defined our 4 different histogram colors. We've also found 7 consecutive histogram bar colors of one color, cyan or red. Now it's time to define the actual momentum shifts. So let's go ahead and define that next. So here I'll say momentum shifts in histogram. Now the way we can define this, we have really 2 different shifts. We have a momentum shift to the downside, a momentum shift to the upside. For our momentum shift to the downside, we're really looking for where we've had 7 consecutive cyan bars. That's true on the previous bar, and this current bar is now a blue bar. So this candle right here would be that momentum shift after we've had, say, 7 in a row. So let's go ahead and define that. We can say def momo down, and for that we need this min cyan bars condition to have been true on the previous bar, and the current candle should be blue, suggesting that that momentum is now shifting. On the other side, we have momo up, which is the exact opposite. That's where we have min red bars true on the previous bar, and our current histogram bar is yellow. Now let's go ahead and test this out. So let's start with the momo down first. I'll plug that in where we have these min red bars. Now what we should see is whenever we had 7 consecutive cyan bars, and we're now coming to that first blue bar, we should see a chart bubble with the number 1 inside of it. Let's see if that works. I'll click apply, OK, apply. Take a look at what we see on our charts here. We have a 1 right here. We can see we had histogram rising, so momentum increasing. And now that first blue bar, when that momentum is shifting, is where we see that chart bubble plotting with the 1 inside of it. Same idea right here, another false signal right here actually, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we have that first momentum shift bar, which is short-lived here. We have momentum increasing about 2 bars later. But so far, we know that our momo downshift condition is working. Let's test the upshift condition as well. So momo up, I'll plug that into our chart bubbles. Let's test that. apply. There we can see we have a 1 right here. Momentum was decreasing, and that first bar where momentum is increasing is where we see our chart bubble plotting. So we know that condition is working as well. So as of right now, we've really pinpointed those momentum shifts. Now we can start to do things like add in some signals or additional conditions to filter out some of these false signals. For that, I like to use the RSI. You can use whatever indicator you'd like, but the goal here is let's try and keep this as simple as possible. So I'll use the RSI, the built-in RSI, which we can reference very similar to how we did the histogram reference at the very top of our code. So I'll say something like def RSI, and let's call this overbought as our overbought condition. And there, our RSI should be greater than some value for it to be considered overbought. Let's give this a default value of, let's say, 60. And later, we can come in and change all of these values that we've hard-coded to make them a little bit smarter that the user can change from the studies menu. For right now, we're just trying to build something quick from scratch that we can test along the way to make sure it's working the way we expect. Now, same thing here. I'll call this def RSI oversold. We can say in this case, is the RSI less than 40 to consider that oversold. Now, if we were to say plug this value into our Momo up condition as well, so let's test this out. Actually, let's leave this as okay first. Apply. Let me go to something like a daily time frame chart so it's easier to see. So this is the SPY on a daily time frame, and we're currently plotting our Momo up condition, meaning momentum shifting to the upside. So check out what happens to the number of chart bubbles if we also layer in our oversold condition here. So that's when momentum shifting to the upside, and we think we're in oversold territory using the RSI. So there I'll say and RSI oversold, and I can plug that in here as well. Now if I click apply, let's see what happens to the number of bubbles that we see on our chart. Do we lose any? So you can see we lost a few bubbles here on the left-hand side. We lost quite a few bubbles here on the right-hand side. That RSI condition has definitely filtered out some what you might call false signals. But perhaps that sensitivity is a little bit much for what you'd like. Instead of changing it from the code, we can now start to make some of these variables a little bit smarter. So let's start with the RSI values first, since we just did that. So there at the top here, I'll give both of these values a name. So I'll say input RSI overbought val, and we can set that equal to the default value of 60. I'll create one more for our oversold value. So oversold val, we can set that to a default value of the 40. I can plug the overbought value and replace this number 60 that's hard-coded with instead this variable. Same thing for the oversold side. Now the benefit of this, if I click apply, okay, and I show you, is you can now just double-click this backtester and change each of those values directly from the studies menu instead of needing to come inside of the code every single time. Same idea here, we can repeat for these 7 values for the consecutive histogram bars. So let's add that value in as well. So I'll say input consecutive histogram bars, and let's set that to a value of 7 as a default. And here I can plug each one of those variables in wherever we had 7 referenced. Okay, click apply. So same idea here, if I double click, you can now change all 3 of those from the studies menu. Now that we have these pieces in play, I think it's time to start writing our add order condition, which is really the bulk of how this backtester works. Now that we know everything's working, I can delete our add chart bubble code. We can also delete the default add order code, which will then give us that first bit of error, which the strategy should contain an add order, and that's exactly what we're about to add. So let's start with the buy conditions here first. We'll say add order. Our order type for this is order type.buy to open. Our condition in which it's going to buy is going to be anytime we have momentum shifting to the upside, so Momo up, and since we've also included this RSI value, we'd say and RSI is oversold. Once that happens, or if that happens rather, use the closing price of that candle as our entry. Now we need to also add in a closing condition for this strategy or for the buy side trade. So there we can say add order, order type, that this time sell to close. And we set our sell to close condition in the case of buy side momentum is that first little sign that, hey, momentum is starting to decrease. So for that, we can use the histogram variable we created up here and simply say, is the histogram less than the histogram on the previous bar? If that's the case, we know that momentum is now officially shifting again, and we can exit using the close price. So this is the buy side. Let's repeat this one more time for the sell side. So I'll copy and paste that down here. We change our buy to open to now sell to open. And instead of a sell to close, we're going to have a buy to close for our short trades. Instead of a Momo up for our entry, we're looking for when momentum shifts to the downside. And instead of the R side being oversold, we want the R side to be overbought. Same idea though, we're using the closing price of our entry. For our exit condition, we're reversing this. We're looking to get out as soon as the histogram shows us that, hey, momentum is now increasing one more time. The short side trade is over. So using this, let's click apply. Once I click apply, we should now start to see the backtester actually plotting things on our charts, taking entries, taking exits. Click apply, okay, apply, and you can now see all of these pink variables, or pink text rather, which are the backtester actually at work. Now if you don't see this floating P&L graph here, click Global Strategy Settings and make sure this setting is turned on, Display Floating P&L with Strategies. Once you have that, click OK. Now let's zoom in to make sure this is working the way we would expect. So I'll use this most recent example, which looks to be a stop. So here we have a short side trade that was initiated with this blue histogram bar, and the histogram on the very next bar continued to keep increasing, so it got out using the closing price. So this right here should be a loss in our report. Let's right click and test that, show report. Very last trade we can see was a loser. So that's working the way we would expect. Now let's zoom out. Let's try and find one other example here. So the example before that, same idea. Momentum shifts this time to the upside. So this should be a buy to open. Try to ride the momentum out for as long as possible, and it gets out at the first time that we see momentum decreasing, and it uses the closing price of that candle. So we know this is taking entries and exits in the place and in the manner we would expect. Now one thing that I think might be a nice to add inside of this code is the ability to turn on and off long entries versus short entries, which makes it a little easier to see what's contributing to this P&L value right down here. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll open up the code by clicking the scroll icon, and we can add in input long entries, and we'll set this equal to yes as a default, meaning take it. And then same thing for our short entries. Same idea. I'll set that equal to a yes for the time being, and we plug in each of these values into our add order conditions. So for our buy to open, if long entries is true and all of these other conditions are true, only then place the buy order. For our short entries, if short entries is true and all of these other conditions, only then place the sell order. So let's go ahead and test this out now. So first off, we see our P&L using all the default values that we created on a daily time frame chart is 3,716 in the S&P ETF. Let's see what happens if I turn off the short entries. That number should change. That number increases to 5,022. So far we know that the short entries were actually causing more of the losses on the daily time frame chart with these momentum shifts. Makes a lot of sense since 5 years also includes the bull run. What happens if we shut off our long entries here and turn on our short entries? So we're reversing that. Let's see what happens to this P&L number. We can see the P&L now goes negative. So that's working the way I think logic would suggest that we expect this to work. Now let's shrink this down to something like, say, a 5-minute, 5-day time frame chart. Let's come back in, let's leave both of these on, see what our baseline P&L is. That's 1703 inside of the SPY ETF. Now let's start to do things like change, let's call it our consecutive histogram bars. 7 histogram bars gives us a value of 1703. Let's see what happens if we increase this to, let's call it 10 histogram bars in a row. Does this value increase or decrease, suggesting that more histogram bars are better or worse? Click apply. More or less the same, 1662. What happens if we shrink this from the original 7 down to maybe, let's say, 5 now? Does that increase the P&L dramatically? 1585. So you can see how that P&L shifts, as you start to adjust the number of consecutive momentum bars. Now let's take this back to the 7, and instead of say 60 as our RSI value, let's try and increase this to 70, and let's decrease our oversold to 30. Click apply. Okay, so now you can see there's a little patch of red here. So we know that this value hasn't necessarily always been as good as the default ones that we created. Now, of course, there's a lot of manual research that's required, at least with this version of the indicator, since you now need to go back, study the reports, try and identify what might be common patterns, common tendencies. How many winners do you have? How many losers do you have? Is it the short side or the long side trade scenarios that are leading to whatever P&L that you're seeing? That's where you can use the Volatility Box version for all Volatility Box members, and it should make that research process a lot easier. Let me show you what I mean. So I now have that version loaded in. Let me turn on both our long and short entries. And now we can study this a lot easier, a lot faster, and it's cleaner to read. For example, on the long side trades, we can see that over the past 5 days, we've had 2 winners, 2 losers. We know the average win rate of the long side trades, the average losing rate on the long side trades, or the loss percentage. We also know the trade duration, so on average about 9.5 5-minute bars, so call it give or take 50 minutes per trade. The short side, however, looks dramatically better, 10 winners, 1 loser. Our average winner much greater than the average loser, so what we'd expect. And we can see our average trade duration here a little bit longer, meaning that momentum shift lasts longer compared to the long side trade. Now what happens, say instead of SPY, you want to test this on, let's call it Apple, just hypothetically, and maybe instead of a 5-minute chart, you want to test this on a 30-minute time frame chart going back 90 days. Now here, you can see off of 90 days, 30-minute time frame chart, what those statistics were. Let's say you'd like to get rid of the extended hours here, so I'll get rid of that. We can then start to view the trade statistics for that particular trade. So on the bull side, 4 winners, 4 losers. On the bear side, 1 winner, but 10 losers. So this is basically a reverse of what we saw in the S&P 500. So hopefully through these labels, you see just how much more streamlined and efficient this process can be. But of course, if you're not a Volatility Box member, you can still come into the baseline version that we just built, right-click, show report, and start to study the trade statistics that way. You can leave on and off whatever scenarios you'd like, long entries, short entries. You can tweak these values however you'd like, and that should then give you a good starting point with analyzing if the squeeze histogram is valuable in timing some of these momentum shifts. I hope you found this tutorial to be useful. Again, you can find download links for both versions inside of the description box below, and you can also play around with the code, tweak it. Maybe you want to add in your own different condition instead of the RSI. Feel free to change that. This is a really nice starting point that you can then start to customize based on your own trading style and really make the backtester work for your particular needs. Take care, everyone. Good luck trading, and happy ThinkScripting ahead.